Okay, good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure tonight to welcome you to the book talk featuring Professor Sandra Wilson and Professor Robert Cribb, talking about their new book, 12 Japanese War Criminals and One Who Got Away, published by the University of Hawaii Press recently. We have our discussant, Sarah Kovner, as well. And so I'm going to give a brief introduction to the speakers. Sandra Wilson is a professor of history at Murdoch University, and Robert Cribb is Emeritus Professor of History at the Australian National University. Both Wilson and Cribb are prolific researchers and writers, and between the two of them, they have published a huge amount of books, articles, dealing with Asia, Southeast Asia, war crimes, national identity, nationalism, and just a whole range of topics. When I was going through each of their collections of articles and books, I was so impressed. I had read a lot of these articles, but I did not know the breadth and the depth of the body of work. And so Robert Cribb has been a writer, a sole author, a co-author, an editor of numerous volumes about Indonesia and Southeast Asia. He is particularly focused on mass violence and crime and national identity, as well as environmental politics. He also is currently editing Volume 3 of the new Cambridge History of Southeast Asia. Sandra Wilson has written so much on World War II, on soldiers, war crimes, and she has spent a good deal of her career really illuminating numerous topics that I think the field of Japanese history is really indebted to. She has co-authored several books with Robert Cribb, and this one being one of the newest. Then our distinguished discussant, Sarah Kovner, is a historian of modern Japan, and she is the senior research scholar at Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University, and she also holds an affiliated faculty status in the Department of History. Her research focuses on international history, war and society, and gender and sexuality, which her first book, Occupying Power, Sex Workers and Servicemen in Post-War Japan, published in 2012, indicates her first kind of foray into, occupation and sex and gender. Her most recent book, Prisoners of the Empire Inside Japanese POW Camps, was published by Harvard University Press in 2020 and re-examines the treatment of Allied prisoners of war in the Pacific Theater. She is currently working on a project entitled Beyond Barbed Wire, which is the first singled author study of Japanese civilian internment and incarceration across 8 countries during World War II. And I just wanted to know, both Sarah's project is a super ambitious project in scope and coverage. And I talked briefly with Sandra and Robert, and they are also currently working on still another project on the war crime trials. And so it's really just admirable, the scope of what the historians that we are featuring today are, working with. It's a huge body of materials. And so without any further ado, I'm going to ask Robert and Sandra to take it away.
So, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming along this evening or this morning, whatever time it is. And Kirsten, thank you very much for the invitation to present. And Sarah, thanks for being willing to be our discussant. We've got a few slides to show, so I'll just share the screen. Okay, so, well, several years ago, Sandra and I were part of a project that was looking at the repatriation and release of Japanese war criminals after the Second World War. That project ended up becoming a book on the whole war crimes trial process, in which 5,700 people were prosecuted in around 2,240 trials in 50 different locations. But like many projects, this one, the trials book, generated new questions. And in particular, it generated the question of why the Japanese military committed war crimes on such a scale, and indeed just what did they do? Well, in fact, these are not new questions, but the problem is that the previous answers often tended to be pretty crude and unsatisfactory. People were inclined to say, well, all the crimes were committed by Japanese, therefore there must be something dark in Japanese culture, or at least in Japanese military culture, that accounts for these crimes. And people brought up ideas of acute obedience, devotion to the emperor, bushido, superficiality of Japanese modernization, which was allegedly just a thin layer over an underlying primitive savagery. People suggested an acute Japanese racism. And one of the underlying problems is that all these explanations were culturally essentialist. So they were about as useful as saying all Australians believe in a fair go or all Americans believe in freedom. In other words, they're intriguing insights into political discourse, but analytically they're pretty much worthless. And specifically, they tend to evaporate once you try to apply them closely to the war crimes cases. We found in our examination of the cases, there was no useful causal line between war crimes and devotion to the emperor, or indeed to any other ideological element in Japanese society at the time. We've discovered that bushido, which features so much in popular explanations of Japanese war crimes, was identified as a culprit only in the 1950s. If you go back to the war crimes trials, the standard interpretation is that bushido is a great thing, but it just didn't work. It didn't work to provide the chivalry that would protect prisoners and others. So Sandra and I began this new project, reposing the question of why the Japanese military committed so many war crimes. And this is a big project that is still underway. We're basically looking at a wide range of war crimes, trying to establish what happened and testing individual explanations, trying to fit the individual explanations into a broader analysis. This book, 12 Japanese War Criminals and One That Got Away, is part of that project because we realized that there was value in looking not just at the crimes, at the category of crime, but also at the people who carried them out. So we've got in this book 13 individual biographies of people who committed war crimes and who, with one exception, were brought to justice for their crimes. So how did we choose our subjects? Well, what we wanted was, okay, this is one of the war crimes trials. What we wanted was a range of crimes, a range of ranks, a range of ethnicities, a range of genders. We've got the only woman who was convicted for a war crime, and a range of locations and a range of categories of crime. So it's what we have in the book is not a statistically representative sample of Japanese war crimes. If we were to do that, we would have a great emphasis on crimes that were committed in camps because those were the ones that were most prosecuted. But we've tried to get a span of the crimes that were committed during the Asia-Pacific War. And now Sandra is going to introduce us to the cases that we covered.
First, I'd like to repeat Robert's thanks to Kirsten for giving us this opportunity, for all of you for logging in, and to Sarah for agreeing to be our discussant. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the people that we discuss, not in the order in which they appear in the book. We have Tōjō Hideki. As you all know, he was Prime Minister He was tried at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East for crimes against peace and for his responsibility for his subordinates' crimes in the field. He's the only one of our subjects who was tried in the Tokyo trial rather than national military tribunals. We have General Honma Masaharu. He took the American surrender on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, and he ordered the transfer of prisoners to a POW camp in what became famous as the Bataan Death March. Kato Tetsutaro was a camp commander of a couple of camps in Japan. He was tried for ordering the summary execution of a disturbed American prisoner, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. In prison, he wrote a short story that provided the title of a blockbuster film, and several films actually, I Want to Be a Shellfish or Watashi wa Kai ni Naritai. Nobusawa Hisashi was a camp doctor. He's there in the front of the photo. He was originally a pediatrician. He was sent to the Thailand-Burma Railway, the infamous railway, which was the site of so many deaths of prisoners. And his job was to run a hospital with 5,000 sick POWs. He had hardly any staff or any supplies. He obeyed his orders in sending sick men out to work. Many of them died, and he was convicted and executed for that crime. We only have a back view of Cho Eun-kuk, a Korean guard, and Robert has cropped this picture to remove what's actually going on there, which is an operation to remove a hemorrhoid. The left part is removed. He was originally a dentist. He signed up as a camp guard on the Thailand-Burma Railway. He was one of 3,000 or so Korean guards. He was part of a group of Korean guards who were notorious for their brutal discipline exercised against prisoners, although he himself was not the worst. Eventually, he was released from prison. He became a taxi driver in Japan. Unfortunately, this photograph doesn't actually show Yo Chul Bok because we don't have a photograph of him, but it does show a musical group in Penang, and he performed in one of these groups. He was Taiwanese. He lived in Penang, was in Penang at the beginning of the war. He was fluent in Chinese, Japanese, and English, and he was recruited as an interpreter for the Kempei Tai. He participated in very gruesome torture sessions with the Kempei Tai. This is the only woman convicted in the war crimes trials in the Asia-Pacific region. Her name is Tsutsui Shizuko. She was head nurse at Kyoto Imperial University Hospital, and she assisted in gruesome operations on unconscious American prisoners who had originally been aircrew shot down over Japan and captured. This is Yunome Kunio. He was posted in New Guinea, where eventually in 1943, a group of 3 men were captured who had infiltrated behind enemy lines and were executed as spies. They were 1 Australian and 2 Indonesians. He ceremonially beheaded one of the Indonesians, as you can see here. In fact, this is the case that produced this very famous photograph of one of the other 3. So Yasuno Chikao is not one of our subjects, but he is the executioner here of the Australian Leonard Siflete. Ichikawa Seigi was a commander in Burma. He ordered the execution of a whole village community in Burma in the final stages of the war. This is Ainoda Hajime, one of our 2 doctors. I think we got 3 doctors or 2 doctors. He had been posted to the Philippines. As the Americans encroached in 1945, he and his group retreated to the mountains where conditions were very difficult and food was hard to find. After a time, they began to hunt and kill local people for food. Aochi Washio was a hotel owner, or no, hotel manager in Batavia. He set up a brothel for the Japanese military administration, and he was charged with confining women as prostitutes. He's in the bottom left, yes, so second row behind the inner suit with glasses. Egawa Fujiu. was a bit unfortunate. Perhaps he got into trouble by going to a party. This is the site of a party. He was a resident in eastern Indonesia, and he became an interpreter for the Japanese Navy. He attended a drunken party at which a local sultan's brother was very badly beaten up. He was sentenced to a short prison term for his involvement. He didn't actually take part in the beating, but essentially he failed to stop it. And finally, the one we chose who got away. Of course, you would all know that there would have been many candidates for one who got away, but this is the one that we selected for the book. He was a junior Japanese officer who did some very terrible things, including inciting the mass killings of at least 5,000 people in the Sukching massacre in Singapore in 1942, and also inciting a massacre during the Bataan death march in the Philippines. What I'd like to do now is go back to just two examples to give some idea of what these people actually did. Yep. Ichikawa. So I'm going back to this fellow, Ichikawa Seigi. He was a major in the Imperial Japanese Army. He was aged about 26, which was pretty young for his rank. In the last weeks of the war, the battalion that he led carried out a massacre of hundreds of civilians in a Burmese village, including women and children. So the context was that the fighting in Burma was very long and complex and bitter. Japanese forces occupied virtually all of the country by the middle of 1942, but in late 1944, the British launched a counterattack from India. Ichikawa's battalion, like all the others by this time, was very seriously defeated, especially after the Battle of Imphal in India. They were down to 15% of their normal strength, which was pretty standard. Meanwhile, the British had parachuted in some operatives to work with local anti-Japanese resistance groups in Burma. There was quite a diversity of resistance groups there. Burmese villagers often supported these British parachuters and the Burmese resistance groups with things like providing information, supplies, providing occasional labor. So they were, from the Japanese point of view, complicit in resistance, and the Japanese commanders knew about that. By 1945, middle of 1945, the local Japanese military headquarters in Ichikawa's area had heard that the British paratroops were active in that area and that they were getting assistance from a village called Calagon. They sent Ichikawa's battalion to investigate. By this point, the danger for the Japanese was very grave. The British were approaching. An attack was apparently imminent. Ichikawa's commander believed that drastic measures were necessary and that it might even be necessary to kill the villagers who were helping the enemy. There was a bit of confusion in the evidence about whether the commander actually ordered Ichikawa to kill the villagers or whether he said that he could if that was necessary. He, in the war crimes trial, he said one thing, then the other. Anyway, Ichikawa's battalion went to Calagon and occupied the village. They rounded up the villagers, they imprisoned the men in a mosque and the women and children somewhere else, and they interrogated some of them. Then Ichikawa gave the order for all the villagers to be killed. They were taken out in groups with their hands tied. They were killed one by one with bayonets and thrown into the village wells. Ichikawa didn't actually participate in this, although he'd ordered it, and he probably wasn't even at any of the several killing sites. A very small number of villagers survived by crawling out of the wells or managing to escape from the interrogation. There was a trial, and Ichikawa was the lead defendant in a group trial for this crime. The prosecution and the defense agreed on a number of things, so they weren't at issue. For example, that Ichikawa had ordered the killings, that the villagers had been helping the resistance, and that the Japanese had had the legal right to take reprisals against villagers. Under international law at the time, occupied people had certain duties and they could be punished if they didn't perform those duties. One of the duties was to comply with government orders. The case revolved around two big issues: whether the scale of the Japanese reprisal was justified and whether Ichikawa and his subordinates should or should not have obeyed the orders that Ichikawa had received, probably from his commander. Ichikawa said that he'd been compelled to obey an order and that there was urgent military necessity to obstruct the British approach and protect the rear of the Japanese army. He was asked why he had had to kill women and children. He said that even they had acted against the Japanese army. For example, even small children acted as messengers to the enemy. As for murdering babies and infants, he said it had been necessary. If they were spared, they would have been helpless orphans and they couldn't have survived, and Japanese soldiers couldn't look after them. So he said it was more humane to kill them. The defense pointed out that both sides in this war had taken actions they presented as justified reprisal. I think this is one of the strongest defenses that I have read in the war crimes trials in what followed from that. They pointed out that hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children had been killed by Allied bombing. The dropping of the atomic bombs just proved that the Allies didn't have any limits in what could be done in the name of military necessity in this defense argument. The defense went on to ask whether it would have been different if the Japanese had just bombed Calagon from the air rather than bayoneting the villages. So, to quote the defense lawyer, to suggest that because one uses a bayonet, there is no need to kill innocent civilians, and then to claim that you can kill them with bombs because it cannot be helped, is little short of hypocrisy. They then went on to say that it was very important to avoid the inference that there was a double standard going on. And they asked, is there something inherently legal about the bomber which there is not about the bayonet? The defense also said that Ichikawa had had to obey orders and should not have had to question them. They pointed out that Allied airmen ordered to bomb cities almost certainly didn't question those orders. They accepted them and were entitled to accept them and to assume that their superiors knew what they were doing. The prosecution simply said that an abominable crime had been committed and that Ichikawa was responsible. At the least, he shouldn't have killed all the villagers, they said. He would have been legally entitled to do other things, burn down the village, impose heavy fines, take hostages, maybe even kill some people, I think, but not everyone. And Ichikawa was sentenced to death. As far as we can tell, he had truly believed that Japan's cause in the war was righteous, that military orders had to be obeyed, and that any action was justified for the survival of the military. He had received orders and he saw no reason not to follow them. That appears to be why he did what he did. And I'll now talk about a second case, Nobusawa Hisashi, the doctor, camp doctor. He'd been sent to Thailand, to the Thailand end of the Thailand-Burma railway. So the Thailand end was somewhat better supplied, nearer to centres of population, not as nearly as bad as further up the railway. But conditions were basic everywhere on the railway. There was no protection against mosquitoes, so the POWs who were working on the railway suffered greatly from malaria and dengue. There were camps up and down the railway. In some of them where conditions were worse, there was dysentery and cholera. In crowded conditions, the prisoners also often contracted diphtheria. And remote camps were almost always short of food and medicine. So there was an awful lot of work for doctors, and there were a great many sick prisoners. As you know, thousands of Western prisoners of war worked on the railway, and a great many more Asian labourers, some contracted, some getting there by other means. Conditions for the Asian labourers were a great deal worse. Conditions for prisoners of war were bad enough. There were railway engineers there supervising the railway work. They decided each day how many men were required for construction work, and they sent their requirements to camp supervisors. The fittest men would then be selected for the day's work, which was often very heavy. The work was dangerous and the men were weak. There was no safety equipment and injuries were common. It's estimated that about, the numbers of course are pretty rubbery, but about 85,000 Asians died working on the railway and about 12,600 Westerners. That's a more reliable figure. Nobusawa was in charge of a hospital at a place called Chung Kai in Thailand, where conditions were relatively good. There was enough food and the prisoners weren't overworked. But the prisoners were sent out from there to camps up and down the river where conditions were much worse. At its peak, the hospital had 2,000 patients. Nobusawa was the only trained doctor. His staff consisted of a deputy who was not a trained doctor, 2 sergeants and 2 medical orderlies. Nobusawa and his deputy were posted around to other hospitals along the railway. One of his major duties, and we think the one that got him into the most trouble, was to determine when prisoners were well enough to be sent back to work. One factor is that among the prisoners up and down the railway, there were a fair number of allied medical doctors and other medically trained personnel. They worked very hard to preserve the health of their fellow workers. And in some camps, the Japanese doctors and the medically trained prisoners worked fairly well together in the interests of preserving the health of the patients. But unfortunately, this wasn't the case with Nobusawa. He and the medically trained prisoners seemed to dislike and misunderstand each other, and this situation had serious consequences for sick prisoners. As in most camps, it was the Allied medical officers who chose the men initially who could work. They would go among their own fellow prisoners and pick out those fit enough. But if they failed to produce enough men for the work that had to be done, then Nobusawa and his deputy would intervene, quite stridently it seems, looking for men who provided any justification at all to be sent out to work. And this had disastrous results for the prisoners. When Nobusawa was questioned about all this after the war, he said he'd just been following orders. In a joint trial, he was accused of inhumane treatment of POWs, causing suffering and death. Many former prisoners submitted written statements about what had happened. Nobusawa was sentenced to death and he was hanged. To the end, he asserted that he'd just been following regulations and superior orders. One of the interesting points is that he was by no means the only doctor tried for inhumane treatment of prisoners. Other medical officers from other camps around Japan's empire were also prosecuted, but Nobusawa was the only one who was executed. It looks to us as though he'd been out of his depth in the middle of the jungle with very little support and with responsibilities well beyond his capacity. He was incompetent rather than malicious, and he failed to build up a working relationship with the medical prisoners under his control that might have helped the situation. Above all, he was sentenced to death because the court believed that a doctor should have done better. They tacitly recognised that rank-and-file military men had no choice but to obey their orders. But Nobusawa was different. He was a doctor, he'd harmed his patients, and according to the court, he deserved the harshest punishment. Thank you. I'll now hand back to Robert.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sandra. So what do we learn from looking at these 13 cases? Well, I wanted to talk about 2 specific issues. One is military necessity, and the other is wartime license. And then if we've got time at the end, I'll say something brief about evidence. When we look at the war crimes trials, sometimes the defense was, I wasn't there and I didn't do it, but if the evidence clearly implicated the accused, then the implicit core defense was almost always that the action was a matter of military necessity. Now, when wartime atrocities were criminalized from the late 19th into the early 20th century, there was always in practice a huge carve out for anything that could be claimed as necessary to achieve military victory. So as a necessary part of tactics, as a necessary part of strategy, or as a necessary element in logistical backup. So it was a kind of huge get out of jail free card, as seen by militaries all around the world. It wasn't quite the escape clause, it seems, because if it applied universally, then you could argue, for instance, that the Nanjing massacre was a legitimate shock and awe strategy. So the big issue turned out to be proportionality. Was the military advantage that arose from an act of brutality proportionate to the human suffering created? And you can see how acute this question becomes when we look at the entrenched positions that many scholars and members of the public have over the dropping of the atomic bomb. The atomic bombs. Were they necessary to avoid a massive slaughter of US troops in a ground invasion of Japan, or were they not necessary given the current state of the war? Could they have been avoided, and Japan would still have surrendered relatively quickly? So within this framework, it's clear in our cases that we're mostly dealing with war crimes. It wasn't proportionate to slaughter villages on suspicion that some of them were in contact with the Allies. It wasn't proportionate to eat people to solve a nutrition problem. It wasn't proportionate to force some women into brutal prostitution in the hope that it would reduce instances of rape. But the question then is, why did Japanese soldiers and officers resort to disproportionality? And this is a question that really has to be answered first at the individual level. One of the big things that we have been aware of is that the vast majority of Japanese troops did not commit war crimes. Some camps were truly awful, others were not. Some transports between Southeast Asia and Japan were hell ships, others were not. Some camp doctors did absolutely everything that they could to help the prisoners of war, others did not. William Webb at the Tokyo trial specifically commented there were many good Japanese in the Imperial Japanese Army. He was saying that's not a defense for those who did commit crimes. So we have structural reasons for the war crimes, but we have to take account of this huge variation in the actual committing of war crimes. So the structural reasons: Japan was fighting a war that it couldn't win. It was bogged down, even at the start of the Asia-Pacific War, in a bitter war of attrition in China. It faced in the United States an enemy whose GDP was 8 times its GDP. So to varying degrees, the Japanese army was always on a knife edge at just about every stage of the war, even in its moments of apparent great victory. It had limited options, and in the face of limited options, violence often seemed to be the most expeditious action. So many of the worst atrocities arose out of panic. They arose out of desperation that led to wrong decisions. So this doesn't deny Japanese agency, but what it suggests is that different Japanese in similar contexts made different decisions. Some of them chose violence, some of them chose war crimes, others didn't. So the context is that the Japanese army was thinly spread, out of its depth, and within the Japanese army establishment, in consequence of that, there were also very many weak and incompetent people in positions of great power, and their response to crisis was often crude violence. So wartime circumstances are a big part of the explanation. But we've realized that war doesn't just put people in difficult positions, it also creates opportunities to do things. If we look at our examples, our cases in this book, Nurse Tsutsui's boss, Dr. Ishiyama, was suddenly able to conduct experiments on living human beings. They were under sedation, but they were living. This would not have been possible outside wartime. Egawa, the son of a farmer in eastern Indonesia, a Japanese settler in eastern Indonesia, was suddenly part of the Japanese military elite, attending parties in the palace of the local sultan. Aochi was a low-level hotel keeper who suddenly became very rich as a pimp. Yunome, who executed the Indonesian on the beach in New Guinea, had a chance to show his swordsmanship. Tsuji, the one who got away, was a kind of Mark Zuckerberg persona, move fast and break things. So amongst the people who committed war crimes, there were those who simply made bad decisions, but there were others who had seized the opportunity to bring advantage to themselves. We also have 3 cases where there was a kind of pathological group psychology that seems to have been at work. This was the Kempeitai interpreters in Penang, Yochubok, the Korean guards on the Thailand-Burma Railway, Cho Eun-kuk, and Ainoda's stragglers in the mountains of Mindanao. And these were all cases in which a sociologically or socially isolated group of young men committed gratuitous violence against outsiders. Now, we're very wary of psychological explanations. We think of it as a kind of last resort. We're aware that those famous experiments by Milgram and Zimbardo have been significantly discredited, as has, for instance, the insights from Lord of the Flies. But nonetheless, we do think there's some element of psychological opportunism in many of the cases of the most gratuitous violence, and that probably also applies to cases of rape and looting. And this insight, I think, reinforces the revisionist argument that the Japanese army was not highly disciplined, even though many of the defendants in the trials argued that they were simply obeying orders. We have abundant evidence that the Japanese army was really very loosely disciplined. Many officers were accustomed to the principle of gekokujo, creative insubordination. Orders were often deliberately vague. One of the great strengths of the Japanese army in the field was that low-level officers knew that they could take their own initiatives. They didn't have to obey the orders that came from above. So alongside the crude overreaction to crisis that we find in many of these crimes, there was a sense of impunity, a sense that individual initiative was permitted and would not be punished. So what's missing from our analysis? Well, what we didn't find is Bushido. What we didn't find is emperor worship. What we didn't find is grassroots fascism or racial hatred. We didn't find that Japanese culture helps us to make sense of these crimes in general. Now, you might argue that war crimes trials documents are not the place where you would find these things, but there's nowhere else. We don't find them anywhere else. And so the assumption that they must have been a factor seems to be something that is pulled out of people's imagination rather than based on serious evidence. And the other crucial thing is that we find no evidence of genocidal intent. There's no idea that groups of people have to be wiped out because of what they are. So the war in Southeast Asia is very different from the Nazi war in Eastern Europe. Now, the war in China presents us with a problem. If you recall the map that we showed, we don't have China cases. And this is because the Republic of China trials, or at least the records that we had access to, are very summary. They're trial summaries. They don't give a serious account of the evidence that was presented in the trial. The Kuomintang was not particularly diligent about collecting evidence. They were engaged in civil war. They were on good terms with many of the Japanese in China, especially General Okamura Yasuchi and the Kuomintang government. actually intervened in his trial to have him acquitted. The subsequent records, or the records of the subsequent PRC, People's Republic of China trials, are also not particularly helpful because they're based on confessions only. And those confessions were produced in ambiguous circumstances. So it's very hard, we can't disregard them, but it's very hard to use them as evidence in the way that we can use the chaotic mass of documents and testimonies that are available for the other trials. So we have, I suppose the big conclusion from the book is there is abundant evidence of Japanese war crimes. There's no possibility of denial. We have 12 Japanese war criminals, one who got away. We could easily have another 12 and another 12 after that. And of course, there were others who got away. But when we step back and we look at the Japanese war crimes, we find in Southeast Asia, at least, the ones that we have examined, we find that they have a great deal more in common with the colonial wars of 1930 to 1960, the wars conducted by Britain, France, the Netherlands, Italy, the United States, China, and Israel, than they do with the Nazi war in Eastern Europe. The big difference is that Japanese war crimes are abundantly documented, whereas all those other war crimes committed in the colonial context were concealed and the evidence has been systematically suppressed. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to us, and we look forward to your comments.
Okay, great. So let's see, Sarah, if you could unmute yourself once Robert stops sharing the screen,
Yep.
and then want to take it away.
Okay. Should I go? All right. Thank you so much, Kirsten, for inviting me to comment. And thank you to Robert and Sandra for the presentation and writing the book and so many other great books. You can see at least one behind me on my bookshelf, I realize, although it might be out of focus. And thank you all for coming. So this is such an impressive book, and the important questions it raises and its careful engagement with archival evidence, again, a hallmark of their writing together and individually. Particularly noteworthy, I think, are the clarity of the arguments and its measured treatment of so many difficult topics. And so I want to briefly highlight 3 contributions I think the book makes, and then I have 4 questions. So, and some of these are things, many of them are things that have Robert and Sandra have already raised tonight. But in terms of contributions, and this is something that I am interested in myself, it moves responsibility from atrocities from the Japanese, and this is said clearly in the book, to the individuality of particular soldiers and the circumstances in which some of them committed war crimes. This is such an important point, and I'm really grateful to them for making it. They stress, and this is something that Robert stressed again tonight, but it's sort of buried a little bit in the introduction, but it's a really important point that they stress that a great many Japanese military personnel didn't commit or facilitate war crimes, right? And that also fundamentally the nature of Japan's war made it likely that war crimes would be committed. And there's a number of there's some writing in the introduction about how the Allies didn't pay attention to acts that could have been war crimes. The Allies didn't encounter the same problems of internal security and didn't resort to the same kinds of brutal repression that characterized the Japanese and military naval forces. And then, Robert, as he was wrapping up, sort of said, you made this similarity, drew the similarity to Southeast Asia, but they point out in the introduction that they did engage in these kinds of brutal repressions and with nationalist insurgencies in the colonies, and that the Allies rationalized, I just want to bring up some more good stuff from the book, but they rationalized the routine killing of surrendering Japanese soldiers with the excuse that their behavior was unpredictable and the mass killing of civilians through Allied aerial bombing was collateral damage, where face-to-face killing of civilians by Japanese forces didn't. And that was mentioned in this first case. All of this has, of course, led observers to blame Japanese culture, turning to Shinto or Buddhism, and they argue against that. The second contribution, I think, is to really give a sense of the war's range and that map. And it looks like among his other talents, Robert is a cartographer, which I see. I saw it just now. It gives a sense of the war's range, the geographic span from Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the range of crimes, defendants from a range of ranks, the three nationalities labeled as Japanese by the Allied war courts, the only woman known to be convicted. And they showed us pictures of all of the, or not all of, they had photographs, if not of the individuals themselves, of the people that are mentioned in their book. And I thought that this was really well chosen. You know, as somebody who's spent some time studying POW camps, you know, I appreciate that as many people as were convicted, you went further and went beyond that. And so the third contribution I think it makes, and I think this is a big one, is that it treats grisly yet important topics in the same clear and even-handed manner as other chapters. I found this really impressive. I'm thinking particularly of the cannibal chapter here, where they delved into the secondary literature just as carefully as in the other chapters, and that's something really hard to do, and I'm very grateful to them for doing that. And then, so then I have some questions, of course, in my role, and my first question is this. Historians and social scientists often talk about agency and structure. So what's more relevant to you as an explanatory force for you in understanding this history? And so that's my first question. And then my second question is following up on that. I know you've been working on the question of what is a war crime for many years, and hopefully you'll write many more books on this, but the conclusion addresses how certain actions come to be defined as war crimes and what makes a war criminal. And so as I read the book, it seemed to me that particularly in the final paragraph of each chapter, there's an embedded argument that not all of these 13, well, it's really the 12, should bear responsibilities for their crime. And I wondered if you thought that was a fair reading of the book. And then third, can the process of, and this is not really explicitly in the book, but I think it's relevant, can the process of war crimes trials ever be just? And how do you think about justice, and how has that changed over time as you've been researching this? And then finally, as you work on this other book about what is a war crime, how has your thinking developed on this issue since you started, and where are you going with that? So those are my questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak a bit. I'm done.
Great. And so I'm going to turn it back to Robert and Sandra and just do a quick reminder to the audience to start thinking of questions that you might want to ask afterwards.
I'll start with agency versus structure.
Good.
I really don't think it's possible to separate them. It is possible to separate them. I don't think it's possible to say which is the more important than the other. And we became increasingly convinced of that, I'd say, as we went along. The structural features seem overwhelming. This is an impossible war that Japan is fighting. The basic problem is that Japan was fighting that war in that way, in those places, with so few resources. But then you come across the fact that most people didn't commit war crimes. Those who did chose to do it. And so we came to center more and more on why did that person choose to do that thing in that place. And that's one reason for this book, which focuses on individuals. So for me, they are very much intertwined. Robert, do you have anything to add?
I absolutely agree on the question of agency and structure. I'll answer that question about the implication in some of our concluding paragraphs that some of our people may not really have been guilty. What we wanted to suggest was not that they weren't guilty, but that they were placed in extremely difficult situations in which they had made the wrong decision. So we don't subscribe to the idea that there is a core of evil in every person which might come out in difficult circumstances. But we have very much been struck by the weakness, the incompetence, the panic, the uncertainty of people who were probably not, or perhaps almost certainly not seriously bad, but who ended up making really bad decisions and who were rightly held to account for those decisions. Just because you weren't greatly evil doesn't mean that you're not to be held to account for bad decisions.
Can I add something there? Occasionally, the courts are perfectly well aware of this. Tsutsui, the nurse, all she did was what nurses do in operating theatres, help the doctors prepare hand instruments and that sort of thing. The court gave her a sentence of 5 years. It's very light. So they really knew. Egawa, the party goer who failed to stop the beating up, was sentenced to 1 month in prison. So occasionally the courts really are recognising, yeah, okay, you were there and you did something or failed to do something, but, and there are many cases of group trials where the most junior members get light sentences, because although the military authorities insisted that superior orders were not a defence, in the case of junior soldiers, they often recognised it. Do you want to take another question?
And then there was the question of whether the process can ever be just and how our thinking on war crimes has changed. I suppose there's several different levels of justice. There's justice in the proceedings. And I suppose our position is that for the most part, even though the trials were often very hastily done, and they didn't necessarily always get the right people, for the most part, they delivered an appropriate outcome. Very easy to find exceptions, very easy to find procedural shortcomings, but as a whole, we're reasonably happy with the overall process. I suppose our thinking on Japanese war crime, the main area of thinking on Japanese war crimes has been that final point that I raised, that what Japanese soldiers did in the Second World War was much more comparable to what Dutch soldiers did in Indonesia immediately after the war, what British authorities were doing in Kenya, what the French were doing in Algeria, that what the Italians had been doing in Ethiopia. It becomes much harder to find any kind of qualitative difference between the Japanese on the one hand and other colonial powers on the other. Differences in scale, some colonies were big, some colonies were small, differences in emphasis. The French in Algeria tortured much more than the Japanese ever tortured, for instance. But in general terms, Japan's comparators are the other colonial powers in those violent middle decades of the 20th century. So that's very much becoming part of the analysis in the current book.